Hi guys, before I get started, I just finished grading your discussion homeworks on R2C, and thank you guys so much for sharing your music with me. I feel like I got to know a little bit more about you. I got some cool film music, some really cool music from home, and some great stuff that you guys are either working on with your teachers or have played before in ensembles. So you all did really wonderful work. So thank you for sharing that with me. And now for today, you're going to need your phrase structure handout. So go ahead and grab that and we will get started. All right, now today we're going to be talking about ways that we can label musical phrases. And we're going to attack the two most common labels that we'll use in Western classical music. In class on Wednesday, we're going to talk about a labeling system that works much better for idioms like rock and pop. But for today, we're going to zoom in on these two specific labels for phrase structures. I have a couple of examples on your handout, and we're going to listen to this first one. It's Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth. I'm sure that most, if not all of us, are familiar with this. So I went and found a unique rendition of it for us. So let's go ahead and just give this a listen. Okay, so that was a little bit longer than what you have on your handout, but I wanted you to get the full experience. Okay, so let's go to your handout and talk a little bit about what we've got going on with that particular example. Okay, what I gave you was a very simplified version. Obviously, you've got the melody there and you have some Roman numerals, and that's really all you need for our purposes today. So let's talk about what we have going on. We've got 16 bars of music in front of us. It's split up into two 8-bar phrases. And let's take a look first at how these phrases begin. So if we take a look at the first really 6 measures of each of those phrases, they are identical. So we get phrase 1 here, phrase part 1, and phrase part 2, and they begin in the same exact way. So let's see how this first piece of the phrase part 1, ends in terms of harmony and melody. So if we're in D major and we're thinking about scale degrees, we end here on scale degree 2. And we have this dominant harmony. And just because I didn't write it there, I just meant that it was kind of maintained throughout. So we've got an 8-bar phrase segment that ends on a 5 chord. So if we were then to label that cadence, we would say that we've got a half cadence here. And then the second part of this phrase starts the same exact way, but take a look at the harmony and the melody at the end. Our melody changes a little bit and we end up going 2 to 1 in those last 2 measures. And we end, instead of on a 5 chord, we land on a dominant. So, or on tonic. So we end on a tonic triad, scale degree 1 in the melody. So if we were to label that cadence then, we would call that a pact. So to kind of sum this phrase up, we've got 2 parts to it. Part 1, part 2. They're the same length, and they begin the same exact way. The only thing that's different is how they end. Part 1 ends with a weak cadence, in this case a half cadence, and part 2 ends with a stronger cadence, in this instance, a pack. Okay, now let's look at something from a completely different idiom. This is the main theme from Harry Potter. So we're going to give it a listen, And I want you to think about how it is similar to the Beethoven example and how it is different in terms of structure and things like cadences and stuff like that. Let's go ahead and give this one a listen. Let's talk similarities first. You could tell by the way that this is arranged on the page, similar to the Beethoven, the two subphrases are stacked right on top of one another. So you can see that subphrase 1 is 4 measures long. Subphrase 2 also 4 measures long. So it's another symmetrical phrase. And both phrases begin with the same melodic content. Now, in the Beethoven, that melodic content extended for a really long time. We are exactly the same until 3/4 of the way through the phrase. Here, we've just got really one measure of exact kind of copy-paste, but both subphrases start with the same material. Now, let's talk about cadences because this one's a little trickier. We don't get a really super functional harmony, but we have enough to kind of determine weak versus strong, which is what I really want us to focus on. So let's talk about what happens at the end of this first phrase. We've got a tonic triad here, actually. And who do we have in the melody? We're in E minor. We have scale degree 5 in the melody at the end of that first subphrase. Now let's see what we have going on at the end of the second subphrase. This is where the harmony gets really funky. It's actually really cool, but it makes for some super messy Roman numerals if you were to try it. But the thing that's most important for us today is that we still land with this arpeggiated tonic triad, but this time our melody is on scale degree 1. So just that simple shift from what scale degree the melody lands on above that same tonic harmony is enough to adjust and alter our sense of closure. So we've got, I'm going to put this in quotes because there's no real preceding dominant in which to call this an IAC, but the idea is that subphrase 1 ends with a weaker cadence than subphrase 2. Two very different examples in terms of idioms and purpose, but very, very similar phrase structures. So let's put some labels to what we have going on here. I'm going to use the Harry Potter example, and I'm going to start drawing kind of arcs on the score. So we've got this first phrase. First little subphrase is here. And then our second one is here. We have our cadences as they are at the end. We've got 4 measures in each phrase. Now we are going to put some names to these phrase segments. So this first phrase is what we are going to call an antecedent. You're wondering where that weird word came from. The root ante, A-N-T-E, means before or early. So antecedent phrase, the early phrase, the first phrase. And then immediately following our antecedent phrase, we get what is called a consequent phrase. So antecedent comes first, it gives us our material, and it ends in a weak cadence. Consequent comes after, it begins with that same material or uses some of that same material, but it ends with a stronger cadence. Now, this is, in essence, the simplest, most bare bones explanation for what we call a musical period. I'm going to recreate this drawing down here. And this is what we will come to know and come to call something called a phrase diagram, where you use these arcs and cadence labels and measure numbers to take a musical phrase and diagram it without needing notes or really that much in terms of prose either. So we've got antecedent phrase and consequent phrase. You have a weak cadence in the middle. And then you have a stronger cadence at the end. Now, probably the most common cadence combination you're going to see is a half cadence followed by a pack. But as we saw with the John Williams score, we had an IAC followed by a pack, which still follows the rules of weak followed by strong or stronger. So that is our musical period. Now, in terms of proportion, they are often equal. We saw that with both of these examples. We had a 4+4 up here, 4-measure antecedent, 4-measure consequent, and the Beethoven gave us an 8-measure antecedent, 8-measure consequent. They are both proportional, they are both even. That is not a requirement, but that tends to be kind of the baseline model of a musical period. Okay, now let's take a look at a different type of phrase that is mostly characterized by its lack of internal cadence. So it's more of a kind of continuous phrase that doesn't get closure until the very end. This first excerpt you're actually familiar with. We used this for one of your harmonic analyses a few weeks ago, so hopefully you've got a little bit of familiarity with it. It's a really short excerpt. Let's go ahead and listen. Okay, now let's talk about what's going on. We still have an 8-bar phrase, but we don't get a really big cadential moment until the very end. So that's the first kind of characteristic change here. We end on a half cadence, but that's really the first time in this phrase that we catch a breath. There's no real break until then. Now, can we kind of dissect this opening a little bit more? I want you to look at the first 2 measures. So the first 2 measures occur on tonic. And then measures 3 and 4, they occur on a 5-6-5. So those 2 measure pairs are kind of encased in their own harmonies. 2 measures of tonic, 2 measures of 5-6-5. Now let's look at the melodic content. So measures 1 through 2. We've got this rising arpeggiation through the first measure. The contour peaks on the downbeat of measure 2. 16th note triplet figure that leads us into our resting note. Now let's look at measures 3 and 4. Just by eyeballing the score, you can see that these 2 measures are related to measures 1 and 2 in some way, right? We've got the same contour. We're just arpeggiating a different harmony. We have the same rhythmic structure, the same texture in terms of the left hand. The only thing that's different is the pitch level and the harmonic content, which the pitch level is sort of a derivative of. But everything else is the same. And you can, just by looking at the score, just by listening to it, hear that measures 3 and 4 are related to measures 1 and 2. So I'm going to bracket them off for right now, kind of in that same arc form that I did on the Harry Potter example. So I've got these 2 little 2-bar nuggets of the phrase. And then we get 4 measures that lead us into our half cadence. Now, let's talk about how these 4 measures kind of get their content. If you look at the opening of, or the content in measure 5, it looks really familiar, right? It actually is measure 2. And if you look at the content of measure 6, it is derived almost exactly from measure 4. So we've heard this content before, we've seen it before, almost in exactly the same way. The thing that's different is they're smushed closer together, right? Before we had to take a measure kind of in between them, but now they're stuck right next to each other. And then when we get our new material is measure 7. So this is all entirely new material. And if you remember from when we worked on this on whenever it was, in a video at some point, this is when we get our predominant too. So this is our final like harmonic change. We get a new harmony in measure 7 that leads us into our half cadence that closes the phrase. So we get these 2 little subphrases that introduce material to us. And then we get this 4-bar phrase that takes that material and manipulates it. In this case, gets rid of the middleman, sticks the material closer together, creates a sense of acceleration, right? Because all of a sudden we've got these 16th note triplets that are occurring in succession. They're occurring more quickly. It makes us feel like things are ramping up even though the tempo has not changed. I'm going to lump these 4 measures all together as one kind of unit unto themselves. Before we put labels on them, we're going to listen to our last example. And I would like you to, again, think about how its structure, because it's not going to sound anything like the Beethoven, right? I want you to think about how the structure is similar to the Beethoven Piano Sonata.
I got rhythm, I got music, I got my man, who could ask for anything more?
All right, just by looking at the score, and I know I rely a lot on this, like just look at it and see what the visual aspect of the score tells you. But just by looking at it, you can see that we've got these little modules. So there's a moment. There's another moment. Break in between. Very clearly kind of 2 separate thoughts or 2 separate moments of thought. And then no break in between this one. We just got one big old 4-bar phrase to end. So how do we kind of compare this to the Beethoven? How is it similar? How is it different? Let's look at the material in measures 1 and 2. Ascending melodic contour, lots of syncopation. Measure 3 and 4, we actually take that ascent and we just go the other way. So same exact notes, we just go in the other direction. Same rhythmic values, so same rhythmic profile, same pitch content, but we are just reversing the melodic contour. So with the Beethoven, we had a sequencing thing, right? So measures 3 and 4 were just a sequence up from measures 1 and 2 with different harmonies. In the Gershwin example, we have identical pitch content, identical rhythms, and almost identical harmonies. I didn't put the harmonies in here, but they are, with one exception, absolutely identical to one another. The thing that is different is the treatment of the contour. And so those 2 phrases, that ascending contour kind of opens the door for something to happen, and then the descending contour in measures 3 and 4 kind of de-escalates what happened in the opening. And then when we get to this bottom phrase, we take that contour back up, and then we keep going up. And we stay in this upper part of the contour until we finally cadence on the downbeat of 8. So when we think about how these final 4 bars behave, again, we have taken content from the first 4 bars, used it, but then elaborated on it and extended it until we get to our cadence. Now, looking at these 2 examples together, you can see that there are similarities in their structures, in their use of motive, and how their use of motivic content lends itself to this new phrase. Now I'm going to put some labels on them. So I'm going to take what we already did, and I'm going to make it a little generic and put it down here. So a musical sentence. Its major characteristic is that we don't get a cadence until the end. It's like one breath almost. I hate to use that, but it's one thought. So you don't get a good cadence until the very end. With a period, you get weak cadence, strong cadence, and they're very clear. With a sentence, it's almost like a run-on sentence. It just kind of keeps going until the very end. No closure until the final cadence. Looking at how we might label those phrases then, a sentence in essence is still 2 chunks, but the first chunk has 2 little baby bits in it. So we've got this first phrase, which I'm going to call a basic idea. And the basic idea is the kind of motivic kernel that lends itself toward the entire rest of the phrase. The rest of the phrase takes what you're given in the basic idea and elaborates on it. Now, after the basic idea, you get an altered repetition of some sort. So the basic idea I'm going to abbreviate as BI. And then this second presentation, we call the basic idea prime. So that little apostrophe thing is a prime symbol. With the idea being that the content is very recognizable as basic idea, but it's been altered in some way to make it different. Maybe it's the contour, like the Gershwin example. Maybe it's been sequenced, like in the Beethoven example. Maybe there is a new rhythm. So maybe the pitch content stays the same, but the rhythmic treatment is different. Something that changes it in some way. And then, so you'll sometimes see people put like a big ol' arc over that. So it's its own kind of opening statement because they occur together. And then after that, we get this longer phrase. And that's what we call the continuation. Now, the continuation is where all the magic happens. The basic idea gives you the material. BI prime plays with it in some way. The continuation is where we see that material get exploited in some way. It gets turned into something new. With the Beethoven, we saw this kind of acceleration and fragmentation. So what I mean by fragmentation is the basic idea and BI prime have been broken up. So we've fragmented it and we've taken some of those fragments and used them in the continuation. That is a really kind of classic element of continuations. Another thing you might see in a continuation is actually similar to the BI and BI prime relationship in the Beethoven. Your continuation will sometimes have sequencing. That's just another way to use that material and make it fresh in some way. You don't have this on the score for the Gershwin, but the continuation is also a great time to introduce cool new harmonies. The Gershwin gets all of its cool harmonies right around measure 5 and 6. So that is also something that can happen in the continuation. And along with that idea of new harmonies is something I'm going to call harmonic acceleration. Harmonic acceleration just means that the harmonies happen faster. So when we look at the Beethoven, we had a harmonic rhythm of about 2 bars to start. So tonic for 2 bars, 5-6-5 for 2 bars. And then in the continuation, it starts to progressively speed up. Tonic for a bar, 7-6 for a bar. And then predominant for 2 beats, or sorry, 1-6 for 2 beats, predominant for 2 beats, dominant for 2 beats. So this progressive acceleration of the harmonic changes, which again makes you feel like you're going somewhere, like you are approaching something important. The harmony starts changing quicker. It gives you a sense of forward motion. Okay, so that's what you have for phrase structure for today. In class, when I see you on Wednesday, we are going to take a look at some phrase structures that are more applicable to pop music, rock, even jazz to some degree. So something that's a little more idiomatic to those genres of music. All right, guys, I look forward to seeing you in class on Wednesday.